What we're talking about this morning, what we're commemorating these 200 years, isn't just a Hawaii story, isn't just for the Hawaiian people. If you are a Christian, this Christian history is your history as well. This is the movement in the hand of God to bring his gospel to these very shores right here in Kailua Kona. In fact, on this very day, 200 years ago, at around 10 o'clock this morning, at around 10 o'clock. So think about it. We're almost at 10 o'clock. At 10 o'clock is when the Thaddeus anchored right here in Kailua Bay. Now, we're talking 160 days plus it took them to go from New England on October 23rd last year to be able to come here on this date, April 4th. And at 10 o'clock, it was Thurston as well as Bingham and Captain Blanchard, who was the captain of the Thaddeus, along with Thomas Hopu, who came ashore to visit with the king and to kind of explain what the American Board of Missions is here to do, what the missionary company was here to do in the Hawaiian Islands. They had a great meeting with King Kamehameha II. He was Liho Liho. Kamehameha had already died previously, and that's a cool thing. You know, by the time the missionaries arrived, the kapu system was upended, the high priestly system was abolished, and there was just this hunger, this vacuum. And here comes the gospel in April 4th, 1820. They came, they visited with Liho Liho and his chiefs, and they talked. They made clear what they wanted to do. And by 4 o'clock that afternoon, they went back on their longboat to the Thaddeus. And even though they didn't have a clear answer whether they would remain here or not, they were hopeful. And we are looking at it 200 years later. And it is our story that played out right here. We thank God for the missionaries who brought the gospel here. We thank God for his hand in bringing Opukahaia from Hawaii to New England to set in motion all of that missionary company to come here. But we also thank God 200 years later, we can look back in history and we can see that God was at work even within the Hawaiian people. If you were paying attention to the documentary, you heard a few pieces come out. And there were Hawaiians pre-missionary who understood this God of the heavens that we know. They knew him. They had a relationship with him. In fact, they saw miracles happen because of this God. Case in point, when King Kamehameha III, Kahu Kealoha, was born in Kealoha Bay, he was stillborn. And it was that same prophet that they talked about who went to that lifeless child, offered prayers, sprinkled that dead baby with water, fanned it with a lauhala fan, and then within moments, breath filled the lungs of that baby. And Leo, the voice of a newborn child, rang throughout the Kealoha Bay area. That was a miracle of resurrection because Kapihe served the living God, the God of life. God was here in these islands before the missionaries came, but what they didn't know is that this God had a son. And that's what the gospel revealed to the people of Hawaii. And it began from 1820. Within a matter of 15 to 20 years, it's what started here was a wave of revival was building up. So that within 20 years, revival swept throughout the islands. And I mean weeping and crying of the Hawaiians on their faces before God. Makua Koana, Titus Cohen was used mightily of God in those revivals. In fact, the largest Christian church in the universe was right here in Hilo on the big island of Hawaii. And that's how much the gospel impacted these islands. So we are so grateful that we can commemorate this very special day of 200 years of moku aikawa being planted here in Kailua Kona, but 200 years as well of the gospel spreading throughout our islands. And then we wondered to ourselves, well, what happened to all those revivals? That is what we got to look at today. What are we going to do What is our response? What is our obedience to the Lord? Just like Makua Kwana, Titus Cohen, obeyed God and came here and God used him. Well, I see a lot of Titus Cohens here. I see a lot of men and women of God here. I can see us doing the very same thing. And we're poised at a very interesting time. 200 years later, we can start a new wave of revival.